guys can be seated. Let me ask you a question for anybody in the room. Have you ever just needed a minute? Like, everything's going on and you're like, I need a minute. I need a minute. And you go do your thing for your minute and you come back and you feel better somehow. I don't know what the minute does to us, but somehow there's some sort of reset that goes on during that time, and it's kind of impressive when it actually works out. Turn to Matthew chapter 14 in your Bibles today, and if you have your phone app, you can do it there. You can turn it into your paper Bible, whatever. Eventually, all this stuff is going to be on the screen, and I'll show it to you there as well, but I want you to kind of have that open. I do think it's valuable that churches utilize the Bible. So we're going to keep doing that. I don't know if anybody's upset about that, but Tony, is that okay if we continue using the Bible? Okay, all right, good. I was wondering, I wasn't sure, but yeah. So in Matthew chapter 14, we're going to find out that Jesus needed a minute to deal with some stuff that he did not get until much, much later. We're in this series called Come See a Man, and ultimately through this series, what I'm just trying to do is take a deeper look at Jesus and how he handled certain situations because he was fully God and he was fully man. And so he has tons of examples from how he lived his life that we can follow, that we can look at and we can go, okay, I can adjust this. I can be more like Jesus if I do this. And we're going to see some of that stuff today, but we're also going to see what one of his disciples did named Peter, and he's kind of a impetuous is probably the word for Peter. But I like him because I think we kind of match up a little bit, me and Peter. So in Matthew chapter 14, it starts out with a story about Herod, King Herod, and he is having an immoral relationship with his sister-in-law, and John the Baptist is preaching against that immoral relationship, rightly so. And so one night, King Herod has a feast, and all of the nobles and uppity-ups come to hang out at his feast. And at a certain point during the evening, a teenage STRI Pipper does her thing. She gets up to do her thing. And during the course of by the way, this girl who did this is Herod's niece, which is doubly gross. We tend to dismiss stuff that happened thousands of years ago because that's just the way the world was. No, this is disgusting what's going on here. So she gets up and she does her dance, and Herod is so aroused by her dance and whatever else she did during that time that he makes a promise in front of everybody, and he says, hey, that was awesome. Thank you for that. As a reward, I will give you anything that you ask for, up to half of my entire kingdom. So this teenage girl, goes to her mom, who is the person King Herod is having the immoral relationship with, and she says, hey, what should I ask for? And the mom says, you should ask for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And so she does. She goes and asks for the head of John the Baptist to be brought in on a platter. The guards go to the prison where John is being kept. They take care of business, and they bring it back on a platter to him. John the Baptist and Jesus had a very, very close relationship. John the Baptist, if you know, was the forerunner of Jesus. His entire life's mission and entire life's work was to go around proclaiming, the Messiah is here. The Messiah is here. The Messiah is here. In fact, John and Jesus were also biological cousins. I mean, they were tight. And so here's what happened when Jesus heard about John's death in Matthew 14:13. When Jesus heard what happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Jesus needed a minute. Jesus needed some time alone to process and to grieve the death of his friend and his cousin. Anyone would have needed a minute when they hear that sort of news. But also in the same verse 13, it says, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. So Jesus got into a boat, rowed out into the water to try and have some quiet time to take a minute. And everybody on the shore is going, where's he at? Where's he going? You think he's going over there? And so everybody is just like this cluster following him, waiting for him to land. And Jesus doesn't even really get the minute that he needs because the crowds are still chasing him down, even though he needs to be alone, even though he needs a minute. So Jesus lands the boat, and Matthew 14:14 says, Jesus had compassion on the crowd, and he healed their sick. So in the midst of his own struggle, Jesus served those who needed him because he was compassionate. That same day, he feeds a crowd of 5,000 men, not counting the women and children. Now, after hearing the news, trying to be alone, can't be alone, healing a bunch of sick people, feeding 5,000 people, it gets toward the evening, and he tells his disciples, guys, get in the boat, just get out of here. I'm going to dismiss the crowd, and we'll see what happens. I'll catch up to you later. And so the disciples leave in a boat. Jesus says whatever he has to say, which I can't imagine what it was, to dismiss the crowd. And then Jesus goes up onto a mountaintop to pray alone. He's going to go decompress, process his emotions, and pray. All of this happened in the same day. Jesus, surrounded by people, healing them and feeding them since he heard the news of his friend and cousin's death. I think it's a fair assessment to say that Jesus was having a rough day. But when the storm hit for Jesus, the storm of that day hit for Jesus, he leaned into his Father by praying. He leaned into his Father by praying. Now, the only reason that I'm recapping all of that is just because I want us to have in mind what Jesus' physical and mental state might have been when we get to our story for today. Too often, I think we only think of Jesus as God's Son, but he was also human. He got tired. He felt pain. He felt loss. He felt fatigue. Jesus felt his emotions. And I think sometimes we forget that. And just like any one of us, Jesus needed to process the storm that he was in. Now, what I want to do is read what happens next after Jesus sent the disciples out on the boat. He dismissed the crowd. He went up onto the mountainside to pray. Here's what happens next in Matthew 14:22. So what we're going to do is we're just going to read through this, and then we're going to come back, and we're going to talk about each verse as we go through, okay? So Ross, you're going to have to stick with me, all right? Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside to pray by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. It's a pretty interesting story in my mind. Pretty interesting story in my mind. So let's go through this. Back up to verse 22. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. All right, raise your hand where are my extroverts? Where's my extroverts in the room? Okay, there's 5 of us. Really? No wonder y'all are so quiet when we're singing worship songs. It's a church full of introverts. All right, where's my introverts? Okay, that is very interesting to know that. How about does anybody feel like an ambivert? Does anybody know what that is? An ambivert? Kind of not really an extrovert, not really an introvert. Few ambiverts in the room. All right. I've wondered if Jesus was an ambivert. Not really fully an extrovert, not really fully an introvert, but kind of somewhere floating around in the middle as an ambivert. I do think that we see Jesus displaying both of these personality types to some degree. He was fully human, he was fully God in the flesh, so it makes sense that since he was fully human, that he would display some psychological attributes. In Matthew 14, we see Jesus spending time with crowds of people and going off to pray alone and recharge by himself. I mean, Jesus spent most of his time with other people. The disciples, other people that were traveling with them, the crowds, those that were trying to bring him down, and just people that needed to be healed. He had tons of opportunity to be an extrovert. However, even Jesus needed time to be alone, to rest, and to pray. Jesus needed time with people, and he needed time alone. Now, I don't care if you're an extrovert or introvert or somewhere in the middle. At some point in your life and people gets overwhelming, and you need some time alone to decompress and pray. Now, I'll tell you, in case you can't figure it out, I'm an extrovert. Shocking, I know. But sometimes I need to be away from people. Now, it only takes me about 20 to 40 seconds to get over that, whereas introverts might be slightly longer than that. But I do need that. And sometimes we need to just process our emotions and pray, and that's okay. That's okay for you introverts to have to go do that, to need to go do that. It's totally okay to do that. And I think we see Jesus' need for this in our story, but we also see him go and find his friends after he's recharged. Now, I'm only saying this stuff to highlight the humanity of Jesus, because sometimes I think we forget that, man, he had emotions too. He had stuff that he had to process as well. So after he went up onto the mountain, it says, later that night, he was there alone. All right, he's up on the mountain praying alone. And the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, which makes me think that maybe Jesus had been there all night praying and being alone. Maybe you ever fell asleep when you were praying? I don't know if that happened to him or not. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. Now, we have no idea how long Jesus spent up on the mountainside, but we do know that he did not come down until he was ready, and that is okay. He processed his grief in his own time, and when he was ready, he went down to them. He took whatever time he needed. That is an important lesson for you. That is a very important lesson for all of us. You ever been to a funeral with somebody? The number one thing that is said at a funeral, it's okay, don't cry. Get it, basically get over it. You can't even be sad and need a minute at somebody's death. That's insanity. Take the time you need to process how you need to process, and don't let anybody push you through that. We see this example in Jesus. In verse 26, when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. Now, I want you to just maybe take a second to try to imagine what would have gone through your mind. You're out on the boat fighting the waves. All of a sudden, some dude's walking next to you. I don't think many of us would have said, oh, hey, Jesus, what you doing? I don't think we would have been casual about that at all. I think we would have been freaked out as well, especially considering that they had been battling their own storm all night. They're tired, they're fatigued, they're exhausted, they're scared. They're in a terrible position in an unrelenting storm, and so they were terrified when they saw somebody walking on the water. They had a lot of fear. I'll say this about fear, it's crippling. Fear is seizing of your faculties. It locks you down. It forces you to apathy. Fear causes us to say and think stupid things like, it's a ghost. We make very, very quick decisions when they are based in fear, and those decisions often stick to us and become our reality, even though it's not actually reality. Jesus wasn't a ghost. He was just there. It's very challenging to avoid that because fear convinces us of a false reality. Fear is a monster. Fear is the opposite of a sound mind. Fear skews reality, but convinces you that what you're seeing is actually real, even though it's not. Fear allows irrational thoughts to rule our hearts and minds and actions, but fear is a liar, a straight-up liar. So when we're struggling with that, what can we do about it? Look at this passage from 2 Corinthians 10. We take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Taking these thoughts captive means that we collect them, we dissect them, and we put them in the trash. Or we can confess them to a friend or Jesus. If we're living in fear because of the thoughts in our own head, we are prisoners in our own bodies. However, God has blessed us with such a powerful mind that we can convince ourselves that it's actually not real. We have such a powerful mind that we can grab those thoughts by the throat and remove them from our lives. And this is exactly what we see Jesus doing with Peter and the other disciples. He steps in to the middle of their storm and removes their fear. Check it out in the next verse. Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." When Jesus spoke into their life, it removed their fear. When they saw him, when they focused on him, they calmed down even though the storm was still raging in their life. And I think Jesus is saying, hey, don't pay attention to that. Look at me. Look at me. I'm right here. I got you. Whatever storm is happening, don't pay attention to that. Look at me. I got you. I got this. So you might be like, well, how do you know that they calmed down? I think they calmed down because of what happens next in verse 28. "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. I think they calmed down because I believe you have to be in a calmer state to ask this kind of question. If they weren't calm, they would have screamed, "Save us! This isn't working. We can't stop doing this." But that's not what happened. Jesus calmed them in the storm. Come on. Where is Jim Caldwell? Does anybody know where he's at? Georgia. Okay. I mean, for real, like, that is a statement that you could tweet that. Nobody, not a single amen. We need George Caldwell here. Or, not George. Did I call him George twice? Jim. Did I call him George twice? He's been gone too long. I'm going to try it again. Jesus calmed them in the storm. That's right. Jesus calmed them in the storm. And we know this because the storm didn't stop till they got back in the boat. Jesus calmed them in the storm. I want you to say that with me. Jesus calmed them in the storm. If they weren't calm, Peter would not have asked Jesus to come out on the water. It seems to me that the panic and fear in the boat subsided only when they focused on Jesus. Only when they focused on Jesus. The storm still raged, but they were calm in the storm because their eyes were on Jesus. So here's something that I think we need to know. Where you're looking is where you're heading. Where you're looking is where you're heading. everything about you, oh man, I got to be careful how I say this. But everything about your physical body is meant to propel you forward. Your eyes go forward, your nose goes forward, your face, everything, your body. It's easier to walk forward than it is to do that Michael Jackson thing. I can't do that. Everything about you is meant to go forward. And everything that is behind you physically, come on, don't make me do it. Everything that is behind you, Debbie, is that enough? Have I said enough? Everybody gets that? It's trash. It's waste. It's gone. It's not where we should be looking. Where you're looking is where you're heading, and the disciples calmed down when they were looking at Jesus, not the storm. Come on, man, that will preach. I'm going to do the sermon again next week. I'm going to do it next week. Verse 30, but when Peter saw the wind, he was afraid, all right, more fear, and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. What happened is that the moment Peter took his eyes off of Jesus and focused on the storm, he began to sink. You know, how often do we do that same sort of thing in our lives? Something bad happens or some storm rises up in our life, and we start off strong, and we go, Jesus, I know you got this. I know you're going to take care of me. But the storm doesn't stop immediately, and we stop reminding ourselves of that truth and pay more attention to the storm. We take our eyes off of Jesus and shove aside his promise to never leave us or forsake us. And we give our attention to the storm instead. It's no wonder we begin to sink. Where you're looking is where you're heading. In verse 31, immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. The reason Peter doubted was because of fear. And the reason that Peter had fear is because he took his eyes off of Jesus. He drifted. He lost focus. This happens when we're driving all the time, doesn't it? You ever been driving down the road and you see something over there, next thing you know, you're straddling in the middle of the lane and Rakeem is pulling you over for some reason? Right? It just happens, you know. This is why it's so dangerous, traffic stops. I mean, there's like on the side of the road because people are like, oh, what's going on over there? And then they rip the door off or hit an officer. I mean, it happens a lot. Because where you're looking is where you're heading. We will always move in the direction of our eyes. Peter doubted because he took his eyes off of Jesus. And so he drifted back to the storm. That day, all this is happening in the same 24-hour period, by the way. Jesus was exhausted, emotionally hurt, physically spent. He faced the storm of loss. He faced the storm on the raging sea. But Jesus did not focus on the storm. He leaned into his Father. When Peter began to sink, it was because he was no longer focused on Jesus, but rather the storm. We can focus on Jesus through our storms because all storms pass. All storms pass. Where you're looking is where you're heading. Jesus did not focus on the storm, but far too often, when storms hit us, it's all we can do is focus on the storm. Wayne Wagner, I am not immune to this. Here's how it happens for me. I tend to take my eyes off of Jesus immediately when a storm hits and try to fix it myself. My wife, who is better than me in every possible way, tends to have faith and focus on Jesus first and then kind of falls off later. It's not until I realize that I can't fix it that I just focus on Jesus. I don't know if anybody else is in that same boat. I say this to my shame, that I don't just focus on Jesus and stay focused on Jesus through the storms. especially if they last longer than I tell them to. I wish I was better at that. But here's what we can do. 2 Corinthians 4:18. We fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary and what is unseen is eternal. We will all, without a doubt, face storms in our life. Nothing will ever be perfect in this broken world. Nothing will. So what do we need to do? We need to fix our eyes on Jesus, no matter what storm we're in. And if we take our eyes off of Jesus and we look at our storm or our problem or our trouble, you'll notice that Peter, when he realized what was going on, when he started to sink, he said, "Lord, save me." And the Bible says, that passage says, immediately Jesus reached out and grabbed him because he was with him in the storm. This is exactly what will happen to us if we find ourselves focused on the storm and not on Jesus and want to come back to him. He will take your sinking hand and pull you up. Where you're looking is where you're heading. When we fix our eyes on Jesus, we can see more clearly. We can see the other side of our pain when we fix our eyes on Jesus. Sometimes I think we forget that there's another side to our pain. And I think that's the work of the devil. It's not the work of Jesus, for sure. But when we're focused on Jesus, we can see the other side of the struggle that we're going through. We can face the storms of our life. I'm going to tell you something, and I don't know if it's true. But it was told to me as truth. So if anybody wants to fact check this later, totally fine with that. It'll be a good enough illustration for us today. There's a major difference. I'm going to say this like I just made it up. There's a major difference between cows and buffalo when they're out grazing in the field. This is the major difference. So they're out in the field and they're doing their thing, eating their grass, doing whatever they're doing, and the cow looks over there and he sees a storm coming. This herd of cows, they look over there and see a storm coming, and they go, "Oh no, here comes a storm." And so they turn away from the storm and start going in this direction. Well, eventually the storm will still catch up to the cows. They will be running along with the storm the entire time, eventually run out of room at Amanda's house and have to stand there, and the storm will be on them the entire time until that storm passes. Right? So they're going with the storm the entire time. But a buffalo, as I was told on Instagram, a buffalo will see a storm, and they'll go, "Hey guys, there's a storm coming. Let's mount up." And so, I don't know if they say that or not, but they see a storm coming, and instead of running away from the storm, they will run to the storm. And as they're running to the storm, it's still coming, and it passes over them, and they're out the other side of the storm much sooner than they would be even if they had just stood still. Because they turned and they faced the storm. They didn't run from it. They didn't walk away from it. And this is how I think that we can face our storms, focused on Jesus. We're all going to have storms in our life. We're all going to have emotional trouble. Somebody's going to die in our life. It's going to be painful. We're going to get exhausted. We're going to get hurt in this world. I mean, these are the storms that come into our lives. And if you run away from that, it's still there, and you're going to be in it longer. But if you face that storm focused on Jesus, it's still going to be a storm. It's still going to be a storm. But I believe that Jesus can calm you in that storm. I really do. Where you're looking is where you're heading. So ask yourself, where am I looking? What am I looking at in my life? What am I focused on in my life? Jesus went through some pretty major storms in his life. I mean, he lost his cousin. He had to deal with the disciples on a regular basis. Lots of big, huge, giant emotional storms. But every time you can see Jesus leaning into his heavenly Father through prayer. Every time. Every time a storm comes, Jesus leaned into his Father through prayer. But at the very end of his life, Jesus faced another storm. I want to read this passage to you from Hebrews chapter 12. It says, "Let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles." Those are storms. "And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus." The buffalo running to the storm, us going into our storm, that happens by fixing our eyes on Jesus, who is the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he what? Endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. I don't know if you've ever thought of it this way or not, but the cross that Jesus hung on was a storm. And guess what? That storm passed. See, it says Jesus endured the cross. It doesn't say Jesus enjoyed the cross. The storm of the cross passed, and Jesus went through that storm because he knew what was on the other side. He wasn't focused on the storm. He was focused on his connection to his Father, and he knew what was happening on the other side of that. I would like us as a church to take a minute to focus on what Jesus did for us on the cross. The fact that he went through that storm so that our salvation could be secured, so that our forgiveness could be secured.